times. 17 times in 11 and a half months. And when we looked at it, we looked at the policy around transfer. And what we found is that the policy was routinely ignored. The reason why Ashley was moved is because she was burning out staff. Now, if I was running a jail, I might think that was a legitimate reason to transfer an inmate. But it really isn't.
What about the Jeremy Phillips case?
I'm not as familiar with Jeremy Phillips. And the reason why I can talk about Ashley is because everything that I would tell you has been made public. Otherwise, I would never talk about an individual case.
Well, certain things have been made public, that you're the prime investigator on that case.
Yes,
and,
but not those details.
Yeah.
So I hope you forgive me. That's an awkward segue when I'm talking about information sharing, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it
But
fits right in.
Yeah.
That
But in Ashley's case, I actually have gone to the trouble of using my authority in terms of making information available about Ashley that I had never made available about anybody else, because it was such a vivid case in terms of the challenges that are being faced by individuals with mental health issues inside penitentiaries. That's one of the other things that an ombudsman can do, is that I can actually choose to put the public interest ahead of other considerations and choose to violate certain other policies or even laws around things like privacy. But as you can imagine, I would do that on a very limited basis.
Are you an ombudsman for the entire prison system or just for the offenders?
Just for offenders.
I see.
Yeah, just for
Because
offenders.
you were raising a moment ago as to whether the movement of this prisoner 17 times was appropriate. I would think from the point of view of the guards and the prison administration, there'd be lots of justification for that.
Oh, absolutely. As I said,
Yeah.
if I was running a jail, I might see it that way.
Yeah.
But you see, the law sees it this way. What the law says is that every decision made that affects the administration of somebody's sentence, their health care needs have to be a paramount consideration. That's the legal requirement. So if you're taking somebody who is chronically self-harming, threatening suicide, and has been in segregation for 11 and a half months, and you are moving them out of one situation and putting them into another situation without addressing their health care needs, you're breaking the law. And that's what I concluded in my report. So, we've also seen increasingly the use of segregation of mentally ill offenders. So think about that complex needs unit cell. Make the floor dirtier, the walls dirtier, shrink the size of the window, turn off the big overhead light, get rid of the second chair, you know, the chair and the little desk. And now you've got a typical segregation cell. And you're locked in that cell for 23 out of 24 hours. You're supposed to get 1 hour outside of that cell a day. And so we're seeing increasingly people suffering from mental health issues or suffering with mental health issues being segregated because that's the best that they can do. And that's an increasing issue for us. So the system, in spite of that $60 million that I was talking about, it still has some...
Sorry, how long would they be kept in segregation in that type of situation?
Well, the segregation is supposed to be reviewed regularly at 5 days, 15 days, 30 days. The law says that there's only two kinds of populations in federal penitentiary, general population and segregated. You can be segregated voluntarily or involuntarily, and you can be punitively disassociated, which means you can be sent to segregation for punishment.
Or protective custody.
Well, that would be the voluntary segregation. And so you're to be, and the law requires you to be returned to general population as soon as possible. So the onus is on the prison administration to always be assessing your circumstances to move you back into general population. In spite of that, right now, today, we've got the highest number of people in segregation over 60 days that we've ever had.
And 90 days, I think, is the big one, and then they really
Well,
start,
90 and then 120.
yeah.
And Ashley was in segregation for an entire 11 and a half months. So, capacity versus demand. I'm sure you've all been following the news reports about the omnibus crime bill and concerns around policy changes. One thing that we know for sure is that as a result of recent policy changes, more people will be spending more time in prison. And that, of course, is the intent of the policy, and the government is backing that up with new investments. And so there has been a commitment to build about 2,600 new cells over the coming years. There's, I think, 32 capital projects are currently underway. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars involved in building that new capacity. So capacity will eventually grow to meet this new demand, but in the short term, we're seeing the use of double bunking grow. It's predicted that 30% of cells will be double bunk cells before this new capacity comes online. So that would mean that we'd be running at about 130% of our built capacity. Yeah.
I just wondered about your second bullet there, over-reliance on long-term seclusion and restraints to manage offenders. And I noticed on your previous slide, there was the issue about forced or about voluntary treatment and so on. One of the biggest problems, I think most of us are all aware, is the problem of not being able to require patients to have treatment that they need in order to make a decision to have treatment.
Right.
And so I'm just wondering, what's the prison culture on?
Can you hang on to that for just a second? I'll come right back to it. I just want to finish this thought about the capacity issue. So the system will be at about 130%. And I just would like to put that into context for you. The state of California, I don't know why I keep on relying on California, but the state of California recently went under federal court order in the United States to reduce its prison population. They were ordered to release thousands of offenders as quickly as possible because they were so over capacity that it was considered to be cruel and unusual punishment to house people in their system. Now, what the federal court did when they told California to reduce their population to a certain number, they actually tried to quantify what cruel and unusual punishment would be. And what they said is, in the state of California, that crowding in their state facilities became cruel and unusual when it got to 137.5% of capacity. Okay, now, I don't know how they got to that now, 137.5% of capacity. So if you had a prison built for 100 and you had 138 people in it, you had to release one because it was cruel and unusual at 138. So in Canada, we're going to be at a situation where we're going to be having 130 people in a prison built for 100. And so my point is that's crowded. In a medium security penitentiary, particularly one of those older, can you imagine that cell, that complex needs cell, even with the big window? Can you imagine a second bunk put in there? So that's what we're going to be looking at in the short term. Now, you were asking about involuntary treatment and use of restraints. That is governed by provincial legislation in whatever province or territory the federal penitentiary is located. So consent to treatment rules in British Columbia are a little bit different than in Quebec, which are a little bit different than in Saskatchewan, but it's where that prison is located, it's those rules. Just like it's the local College of Physicians and Surgeons, which provides oversight over the medical care of College of Nursing that provides oversight over how the nurses conduct their practice. And so it varies a little bit. So we actually deal with cases sometimes where somebody might be, well, in Ontario Form 1, designated, declared, and they get, and so their consent is taken away from them, and they'll be given treatment against their will. But those rules are a little bit different in different provinces.
Do you find that they're implemented appropriately? Because we don't always find that the police here have a full understanding of exactly how that is worded.
Yeah, I want to be really careful because I don't want to, the corrections is a difficult business, and Correctional Service of Canada has about 17,000 employees, and they're housing about 15,000 men and women behind bars, and there's about another 9,000 that are being supervised on parole in the community. So with all those people, there's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of interactions every day, and the vast majority of them are helpful, appropriate, legal, professional. Correctional Service of Canada is one of the best correctional services going. I mean, it's a model service in many ways, so I don't mean to demonize them at all. This is an area, though, that's very troubling, because we have come across many cases where the use of restraints and the use of involuntary medication take place punitively as opposed to medically. And so, remember I told you about some of the videotaping of use of force incidents? Well, we've reviewed videotapes where we have medical people holding syringes saying, I told you, if you don't settle down, you're getting another one of these. And we've had people so drugged up before transfer that it is frankly malpractice. We've seen people kept in restraints well beyond any specified periods in terms of physical well-being, stewing in all their waste, etc. And the only conclusion I can come to after reviewing those cases is that was done punitively. So it's a problem. Now that's why I want to be careful, is I don't want to say that defines practice in penitentiaries, because it doesn't.
I was thinking of the flip side of what you're suggesting there, and that is not acting on treatment when it isn't.
Yeah. Well, and again, consent can be an issue. But what we find more often than not is that it's easier to have somebody's capacity to make consent taken away from them inside a prison than it is in the community.
And there's also the,
In terms of the long-term seclusion on this chart,
Yes.
and your previous photo of the cell and reference to isolation, is that cell a totally enclosed box of a room? Is there any view out? Is there one side with open bars? Or is it a totally closed room that you're shut into?
It's a room like that with a much smaller window typically for natural light, much smaller, maybe this size. And typically would be a solid door, again with a plexiglass window there, and then a food slot here. And typically when the nursing staff comes by in segregation, which they're supposed to do once a day and make sure that you're okay,